Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I'm going to try to answer several questions that I've gotten on the channel through comments. I was trying to make video about each one of them, but they don't I I don't want to pad a video just to make 10 or 15 minutes, and I think I can do a number of comments if I just go through them all at once. So I'm going to try to do that, see how that works. Let's start with Lazar Satulovic 6484, who asks, I wanted to ask if you ever had any ideas for an RPG that is more grounded and set in a real-world historical setting. If not, what period would you say is your favorite or most influential or inspiring for designing your worlds? I will say I don't really have a real-world historical setting that is my favorite. Not a huge history buff. I know it. One of my biggest complaints in high school to one of my teachers who was trying to get me to move from history to AP history was, you have literally never taught me anything past World War II. Nothing. I don't know anything about the Vietnam War. Don't know anything that happened in literally the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, or the 80s. And so I told him, unless you're going to teach me that in your AP history class, I'm not interested. He got so mad, he took it up with my mother, who basically said, I agree with my son. And I didn't take AP history. So, while I don't have a historical setting, when push comes to shove, I probably like medieval settings the best. Mainly because most of my games are, here's a setting with a twist, and Arcanum was, here's a medieval setting that had an industrial revolution. I like, here's a medieval setting that may have zombies, or here's a medieval setting that may have, a vampire or whatever. I find that setting a little more fun to design for, because then once you get to modern day with police and guns, it's less interesting. And then when you get the future where it's like I've got scanners and I can beam out, if push came to shove, I'd probably pick around 14th century with a twist to make as my setting. So the next question, Sharp Dog 664 asks, Hi Tim, I would love to hear your thoughts on catering and food service whilst you was working at Interplay Troika, and currently what it is like at Obsidian. Do they have weekly dishes based on the games you create and so forth? I hate to break it to you, Sharp Dog, but there are no catering and food services at any of those companies. At Interplay, we may have been given food as a launch day celebration when your game shipped. Troika, we did 3 kinds of food. We did a regular weekly one, a crunch time one, and then a special when we shipped a game. We had special celebrations for that. But usually we just brought stuff in from restaurants. Same thing at Carbine and Obsidian. It was really common to get food, especially dinner, offered to you during crunch. When games shipped, we had big launch parties. The Obsidian launch party for Outer Worlds, the food there was so fun. It was themed on the food from Outer Worlds. We had tarmac and cheese. We had a whole bunch of really fun stuff. But regular food service, no. So the next question, PowerGI3996 asks, what is the difference between AA games like the Outer Worlds, I think, and you're right, and AAA games? Is it just scope and cost? Also, what are the differences between working on AA games versus AAA games, if any? So PowerGI, this was almost its own video, because my answer for this is a little longer, and I'll give examples. But it boils down to it's mostly budget. AA has a smaller budget than AAA. But the budget means less time to make the game, a smaller team to make the game and to QA the game, smaller marketing budgets. There are some great games out there that you've never heard of because they don't have a marketing budget. And there are some good games out there that you've played and liked because they had an amazing marketing budget. And then budget also affects scope. But there's a caveat there, and that's what I wanted to mention. That's really why I wanted to answer your question. Budget tends to be linear. As budgets go up, it tends to be a linear increase. So you go from a 1 million to a 5 million to a 10 million game. And yeah, it goes up to 100 million. But scope is exponential. Every feature you add is exponential to the scope of the game because they all interact. I talk about often there's a fabric, there's like a weave of design. I'll give you an example. In the past I've told people I kind of wish I had taken newspapers out of Arcanum because a lot of work went into them, but they were really only connected to quests. And let me give you an example of how scope works, how everything gets interconnected, and why I mentioned newspapers. So in Arcanum, you could hear rumors from people. It was systemic. These are all systemic things. So a designer could just put R: in his dialogue. And there I have a whole video on generated dialogue. And that could generate a rumor, which could lead to a nearby dungeon or attacking bandits or whatever, and that would be a quest, a side quest. Quests themselves exist that the players could put in, and those also had generated dialogue opcodes that could put them in. And quests could advance the story state, and the story state was also systemic. It was something that was stored, so at any particular time, someone could say, what's our story state? And it could tell you where in the linear storyline you currently were, even if you were getting to that point in the linear storyline in a non-linear way. So those are all systemic features of Arcanum. And then I added the newspaper, which was also systemic. What it was supposed to do is connect to each one of those. You were supposed to be able to read the newspaper and possibly get a rumor, which could then lead to quests. You could read the newspaper and directly get a quest from it. You could read the newspaper and see what the story state was. All we really ended up shipping with was quests could, when they change state, inject something into the newspaper queue. Queues were generated randomly. Newspaper headlines were generated randomly, but they'd also look to story state to see if something major should be said. Quests could inject things saying, hey, at the next newspaper, say this. So like if you burned down a factory in Trant, I think that got injected as a newspaper headline. So newspapers and rumors and quests and story states were all supposed to interact a lot more than they did. Why didn't they? Budget. Ran out of time to do it. Why didn't I remove newspapers? Because as I like to remind producers, removing something doesn't save time. Removing something takes time. If I were to remove newspapers, we'd have to fix up when quests were planning to inject stuff into newspapers, because it wasn't enough just to make that injection do nothing. Because maybe the quest person would I need some other way for the player to know that this quest changed something in the world. We'd have to figure out some other way. Maybe it would become the quest giver would just tell you right then when you finished the quest and change the state, rather than have it go into the newspaper. They would just tell you. But even then, that was kind of some people had planned for the newspaper to be the way it got conveyed. So I wish newspapers had been much bigger than they were. And if I'd known they would be as small as this, I wouldn't have put them in. But even taking them out wasn't possible because we just didn't have the budget for it. And yes, Outer Worlds was AA, not AAA, which is why it was shorter, which is why its feature set wasn't as big as what I wanted, which is why Monarch wasn't as big as what I wanted. It's all goes down to budget. Anjan Filipovic 2851 asks, is there a better way to make an encounter with a high-level boss or enemy than just more hit points? It's 2023, and I still feel the majority of RPGs use the same old boring concept of bullet sponge, which makes the game just more tedious and not hard or challenging. Oh yeah, there's a whole bunch of things you can do with bosses, and I've seen these in games, and I know you know what they are. One I love is stages, and I mean that both the actual physical realized stage that the boss is on, and also a phase-based one. So the physical stage is when the area the boss is fighting in actually matters, when there's cover, when there are things you can adjust to create pits or lava that can damage you when you go into, when you have to watch out for hazards in the world in addition to the boss, when there are hazards you can get the boss into. Those are all ways of making fun boss encounters that have more to do with the area the boss is in than the boss itself. But there's also phase-based stages that a boss can go through. And I know you've seen this, where over time the boss changes. He may change physically. He may change what attacks he has. He may change what defenses he has. And what's great about that is Most of these are telegraphed to the player somehow. Like all of a sudden, he turns, to a different shape, or now has a shield or whatever, so he won't get damaged as much. You have to do something else. These are all those phase-based ones are really good ways of making interesting boss fights because the player has to react to them rather than just shove as much damage into the boss as possible. Another thing you can do to make bosses more interesting is to give them henchmen, give them extra things, creatures on that stage that they're fighting on that fight for them. And a lot of times these are just trash mobs, but trash mobs are important because not only are they fun for you to do AoE spells on, but a lot of games have mechanics that whenever you kill something, you get a bonus. Fallout 4 did that. Whenever you killed something, you would get, if you had a certain perk, you could increase your critical hit or even bank it if you had another perk. So there was a Mirelurk Queen boss that would shoot out these little Mirelurk spawn. Those were great if you had a luck-based character and you had those perks for shooting the spawn, getting a bunch of critical hits banked, and then using them on the Mirelurk Queen. That was cool. Other things you can do, especially in RPGs, is you can have some pretty high hit point henchmen helping the boss that you've met before. Maybe you've met them in the storyline. You've done quests for them or quests that involve them. And then, boom, there they are with the boss helping them out. And oh, God, that guy's got that really powerful laser, or that guy's a sniper rifle, or that guy does this AoE attack. The telegraphing of the attacks they do occurred in earlier encounters you had with the boss's henchmen, who then show up to help them. You can also just have low hit point henchmen that just exist to sap your health, or your mana, or create hazards, or do whatever they're going to do. But that's a way you can make a boss a lot more interesting than just putting health on them. Stavros Nikolaou and many other people asked a question: do you feel similarly unconcerned about save scumming, or is that behavior something worth mitigating by design? In the latter case, what are some good ways to prevent or minimize save scumming? I think what he meant, I was unconcerned with, I believe it was speed runs. And all I can tell you is I'm completely unconcerned with save scumming. I don't care. Most of my games let you save anywhere. I even let you save in the middle of combat in my games. And there's a lot of games that, while they let you save anywhere, they disable saving in combat. Just because there's a lot of game state associated with combat. So making a save game that works in combat is a lot of extra work. But I thought it was useful. And I don't mind if people want to save anywhere. I understand the frustration of if there are places, checkpoints that you get saved, that you have to redo a lot of things over and over and over again. Because a designer thought, well, I don't want you to save right before this encounter or right before this thing. And yes, save scumming means people can save right before picking a lock, or save right before a particular combat, or save right before you're going to go into a conversation and try to use your speech skills. I'm okay with that. It's, to me, what's part of an RPG. And then finally, because wow, I'm going a long time. Hollow8136 asks, so I'd really love to hear your general thoughts on asset reuse and what goes into the decision making for what needs new assets and what can reuse or retool existing ones. That's a good question, Hollow. I personally like asset reuse, and I'm assuming you mean more than just art asset reuse. Because even though, like at Troika, we had very little art asset reuse in our games because we made 2 isometric and then a 3D, and the 2 isometric had such a different art look. But Arcanum and Temple did use the same engine with modifications. I think Bethesda's done a really good job of reusing the same engine for decades. And Fallout New Vegas was only made because, in that short period of time, because they got to reuse a lot of assets that were already supplied with the engine. So I'm all for asset reuse. I think there is a group of developers who want to make brand new stuff for every new game they make, even if they're now currently reusing engines, like they use Unity or Unreal or their own internal engine for every game. But for me, I'm like, if you can reuse assets, trees, rocks, textures, engine components, sound effects, anything like that, if it makes sense to reuse them, I really don't believe in remaking the wheel every time. I do think you should make new stuff. I don't want to make just a game where you're reshuffling assets like a deck of cards, but I think judicious use of reuse of assets is a smart game development technique. I wish more companies would do that just so games could be made a little faster. Okay, I think that's enough questions for today. I hope I answered a lot of people's questions, and I will do this again when I've got another stack of questions that have shorter answers.